In 2013, a young mother and her little daughter mysteriously vanished during a short forest trip. For weeks, no one knew where they had gone, and not a single trace was ever found. Everyone believed it was. But 10 years later, that silence was suddenly broken. A wildlife camera accidentally recorded a scene that sent chills down the spine of anyone who saw it. The shadowy figures of a woman and a child, moving unsteadily through the night, exhausted and fearful. The footage didn't provide answers. It raised darker questions. Why were they still alive days after their disappearance? And what were they running from in the work? The mountains remained silent. Footprints vanished beneath the mist, and the truth lay buried for a decade. They were not daring adventurers, just two ordinary people who stumbled into a mystery no one has ever been able to explain. And from the moment that camera captured them, their fate became one of Montana's most haunting. The woman who vanished was not a risk-taker, nor someone seeking thrill or danger. Her name was Evelyn Carter, a 32-year-old single mother known in her small Montana town for her kindness and quiet nature. Evelyn had once worked as a high school English teacher, and although she had left the classroom years earlier to raise her daughter, she never lost her love of books or her thoughtful way of speaking. Neighbors described her as gentle, the kind of person who would pause to listen, who never raised her voice, and who always seemed to carry a certain calm presence with her. She lived a modest life on the outskirts of Billings. Her days were filled with routine, grocery shopping, long evenings reading by the lamp, and afternoons spent helping her daughter with schoolwork. She was not wealthy, not ambitious in any worldly sense. Her greatest source of pride was her daughter, Amelia, who was only 8 years old at the time. Amelia was the kind of child who could make friends instantly, her curiosity spilling out in endless questions. She collected small things, smooth river stones, pressed leaves, scraps of paper with doodles. She had a habit of keeping these little treasures in a notebook she carried almost everywhere, a notebook that was never recovered after her disappearance. Those who remembered Amelia often spoke of her laugh, a bright ringing sound that seemed almost too alive to be silenced. For both mother and daughter, the outdoors was not about thrill-seeking, but about peace. Evelyn liked the quiet of forest trails, the way birdsong echoed through the trees. She wanted her daughter to see the beauty of the natural world, to grow up appreciating silence as much as play. The two often took short picnics into the countryside afternoons, with sandwiches, a blanket, and a small point-and-shoot camera. They were not seasoned hikers, not the kind of people who would wander recklessly into the wilderness. They knew their limits. That summer of 2013, Evelyn decided to plan something slightly different. The school year was approaching, and she thought a short camping trip, just the two of them, would be a special way to end the season. It would not be far, only a few hours' drive into Glacier National Park, a place she had visited once as a child. She packed modestly, sturdy shoes, jackets, a tent, a few days' worth of food. Nothing extravagant, only what she felt was necessary. Neighbors recalled seeing Evelyn loading her pickup truck early that morning. Amelia sat in the passenger seat, her face pressed against the window, grinning with excitement. To anyone watching, it looked like the beginning of a simple adventure, a mother giving her daughter a memory to hold on to, something to talk about when classes resumed. No one could have guessed it would be the last time either of them was seen leaving town. The drive itself was unremarkable. They stopped at a gas station to buy bottled water and granola bars. The cashier later remembered Evelyn's polite smile, and Amelia bouncing on her toes, eager to get back on the road. It was an ordinary encounter, one that only gained significance in hindsight. When they finally reached the park, the air carried the crispness of pine and the distant chill of snow still clinging to the peaks. Evelyn parked in a gravel turnout, taking a few minutes to show Amelia the wide, jagged ridges of the mountains. To the little girl, it must have felt like stepping into a storybook. That night, they camped near a quiet riverbank. Evelyn set up the tent while Amelia gathered pine cones, skipping back and forth across the rocks. Later, they built a small fire. Evelyn read aloud from a worn paperback, her voice mixing with the crackle of the flames, while Amelia tried to capture sparks floating upward with the lens of her camera. Other hikers later recalled hearing faint laughter that evening, the sound of a child echoing through the trees. It was peaceful, simple, ordinary. And perhaps that is what made the tragedy all the more haunting. These were not adventurers courting danger. They were only a mother and her daughter, hoping for a weekend in nature. But the forest had other plans, and by the time dawn broke again, their story had already begun, slipping into silence. The following morning, the forest was alive with its own rhythm, birdsong in the canopy, the rush of the river nearby, the whisper of wind threading through the trees. Evelyn and Amelia ate a simple breakfast of bread and fruit before setting off on one of the well-marked trails leading deeper into the park. Evelyn carried the heavier pack, while Amelia had her small canteen and notebook strapped securely to her side. Hikers who crossed paths with them later remembered the sight clearly. Evelyn's polite nod, her soft smile as she guided her daughter across uneven ground. Amelia, in contrast, was full of energy, darting ahead a few steps, then running back to ask her mother questions. At one point, she stopped a couple on the trail and asked them where the fork ahead might lead. The strangers remembered her bright eyes, the way she clutched her notebook tightly against her chest. No one thought much of it at the time. Only later would that fleeting encounter become the last confirmed sighting of the two together. By early afternoon, the weather had begun to shift. Clouds gathered quickly over the peaks, blotting out the clear sky from the morning. The air cooled, and a sharp wind rushed down from the ridges. According to weather reports filed later, a sudden front had swept into the area, bringing heavy rain and dropping temperatures overnight. For two people inexperienced with long stays in the wilderness, the change could not have come at a worse moment. Still, by all accounts, there was no sign of panic. A ranger stationed near the entrance remembered seeing Evelyn's pickup truck parked neatly in a gravel turnout. He assumed the campers would be fine. They had chosen a common trail, one frequently visited by day hikers. But somewhere beyond that familiar path, Evelyn and Amelia disappeared into the deep folds of the forest, leaving behind no clear indication of where they went next. When they did not return that evening, there was no immediate alarm. Families often extended their stays, caught up in the quiet of the mountains. It wasn't until days later, when phone calls went unanswered and Evelyn failed to show up for a scheduled appointment back in town, that concern grew. Friends began calling rangers, who in turn checked the entry logs. They confirmed what no one wanted to believe: mother and daughter had never checked back out. The first search efforts uncovered faint traces: ashes from a campfire, a few food wrappers scattered along the bank of the river, and the small, unmistakable boot prints of a child. But the trail ended abruptly, as though the forest had closed itself around them. Searchers fanned out in every direction, their voices echoing through the valleys, calling names that never came back in reply. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning the slopes with thermal cameras. Dogs were brought in, following scents that vanished at the edge of streams or dissolved against the rocky terrain. Yet, nothing more was found. No torn clothing, no abandoned backpack, not even the remnants of Amelia's notebook. It was as if mother and daughter had simply walked off the trail and dissolved into the wilderness itself. By the end of the first week, whispers of unease began to spread. Evelyn was not reckless. She had planned carefully, packed cautiously, and chosen a popular trail. Amelia was too young to wander far alone. For those who knew them, the idea that they had simply gotten lost seemed hollow. Something else had happened out there, something that left no clear sign behind. As the storm clouds cleared and the sun returned to Glacier's peaks, the forest seemed unchanged. Birds still called, rivers still flowed, the trails still wound through the trees as if nothing had occurred. But somewhere out there, two people were missing, two people whose last ordinary day had already become the beginning of one of Montana's darkest mysteries. When Evelyn and Amelia did not return home, worry began to spread quickly. At first, neighbors assumed perhaps they had decided to extend their trip, to spend one more night beneath the stars before the school year began. But when Evelyn failed to pick up a scheduled grocery delivery and phone calls went unanswered, concern turned to alarm. By the end of that week, the police were notified, and soon Glacier National Park rangers were mobilizing for what would become one of the most exhaustive search efforts in the region's history. Searchers started with the basics, the turnout where Evelyn's pickup truck had been found. From there, they retraced the trail she was believed to have taken. It was a familiar path, winding along the river before splitting into several forks that led deeper into the park. Within hours, they discovered faint signs that the pair had indeed been there. Ashes from a small campfire, food wrappers pressed into the dirt, and the tiny outline of a child's bootprint near the water's edge. But just as quickly as the signs appeared, they vanished. The trail ended without explanation, as if the forest itself had swallowed them whole. Over the next several days, the search expanded dramatically. Helicopters circled overhead, their thermal cameras scanning for any sign of heat against the cold mountain landscape. Ground teams moved in grids, marking their paths with bright tape, sweeping every ridge, ravine, and streambed. Specially trained dogs picked up faint scents that carried for only a few hundred yards before dissipating entirely. It was as though something or someone had cut the trail short. The weather complicated matters. The storm that had swept through the night of their disappearance left behind swollen rivers and slippery terrain. Searchers battled mud, thick undergrowth, and unexpected rock slides. Every possible explanation was considered. Perhaps Evelyn had led Amelia toward higher ground to escape rising waters, or maybe they had followed an animal trail and become disoriented. Yet none of these theories fit the complete absence of belongings. Lost hikers usually left a trail of evidence, discarded items, torn clothing, even crude markings left behind in desperation. Here, there was nothing. By the end of the first week, over 100 volunteers had joined the effort. Families from nearby towns brought food to support the searchers. Candlelight vigils were held in Billings, where Evelyn's colleagues from the school she once taught at spoke tearfully of her kindness and devotion as a mother. The local newspaper carried Amelia's smiling school portrait across its front page, beneath the headline, "Mother and Daughter Missing in Glacier Park." As the search stretched into its second week, tension mounted. Rangers admitted quietly to reporters that they were puzzled by the lack of evidence. The forest was vast, yes, but usually it offered at least fragments of a story. In this case, it remained mute. "It's like they walked into thin air," one search leader said. Speculation began to grow. Some suggested that Evelyn and Amelia may have drowned attempting to cross the river, their bodies carried downstream beyond the search perimeter. Others believed they might have suffered a fall from one of the cliffs and lay hidden beneath rubble or dense foliage. But even as helicopters scanned every gorge and dogs combed the banks of the river, nothing surfaced. By the third week, the atmosphere had shifted. What began as a rescue mission had become a recovery effort. The hope of finding Evelyn and Amelia alive grew slimmer with each passing day. Searchers described a strange heaviness in the ravine where the bootprints were last found, a silence that pressed down on them as if the forest itself resisted their presence. Back in town, the farmhouse where Evelyn and Amelia had lived remained dark. The blinds stayed drawn, the yard unkempt. Neighbors left flowers on the porch, but the house stood in eerie stillness, as though waiting for its owners to return. Margaret, Evelyn's sister, gave emotional interviews, her voice breaking as she pleaded for the search to continue. "Please don't give up," she told reporters. "They're out there. I know they are." But resources were finite. By day 20, search teams were scaled back. Helicopters were reassigned. Rangers spoke carefully to the media, suggesting that perhaps the mother and daughter had simply become disoriented and succumbed to the harsh elements. It was the most reasonable explanation, they said. And yet, to those who had known Evelyn the careful planner, the cautious parent, that explanation felt painfully insufficient. What lingered most was not what had been found, but what had not. No backpacks, no clothing, no trace of Amelia's notebook or the small camera she carried with her. Just a single bootprint, some ashes, and silence. The search had stretched across valleys and ridges, into rivers and caves, but the wilderness had yielded nothing. It was as if the mountains had made a choice, to keep their secret, to draw a curtain that no human effort could lift. By the 21st day, hope was nearly gone. Families whispered of closure, but closure requires evidence, and in this case, there was none. The official search was reduced further, the case poised to fade into a haunting statistic, another unresolved disappearance in the unforgiving wilds of Montana. Yet just as the search was about to end, a discovery would jolt the investigation back to life. By the 22nd day, the official search was already shrinking. Teams were reassigned, volunteers returned home, and the sense of urgency that had carried the effort for weeks was beginning to fade. The case seemed destined to become another unsolved entry in the long history of disappearances in America's wilderness. But then, by sheer chance, one ranger stumbled across something that would reignite the investigation and haunt everyone who saw it. Ranger Daniel Foster had been tasked with one of the quieter, more mundane jobs, maintaining the park's network of wildlife cameras. These cameras had been set up in remote areas to track animal populations, elk grazing, bears wandering across trails, mountain lions moving through ravines. Most of the time, the footage was uneventful, sometimes even boring. But when Foster retrieved the memory card from a camera deep in a narrow ravine, he knew almost instantly that what he had found was anything but routine. The footage was time-stamped for 12 days earlier, meaning it had been recorded nearly 2 weeks after Evelyn and Amelia vanished. At first, the screen showed nothing remarkable, just the grainy gray of infrared, branches swaying in the wind, the faint shape of a deer moving through the background. But then, movement emerged from the shadows. 2 figures. At first, the shapes were indistinct, blurred by the low resolution. But as they moved closer, their outlines became unmistakable. One was taller, walking slowly, burdened by exhaustion. The other was smaller, clinging close, each step unsteady as though her legs could barely carry her. For a brief, chilling moment, the taller figure turned her head toward the camera. The angle was imperfect, her features partly washed out by the lens, but those who knew Evelyn recognized her instantly. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale and strained, her eyes darting toward the darkness beyond the frame. Next to her was Amelia, her head lowered, her small hand gripping her mother's sleeve. She looked fragile, tired, and afraid. The clip lasted less than a minute before the two disappeared back into the trees, swallowed once again by the night. Yet in that fleeting footage lay proof that Evelyn and Amelia had been alive far longer than anyone had believed possible. When investigators first viewed the recording, the command center erupted. There were gasps, hurried whispers, questions shouted across the room. How had they survived nearly 2 weeks without help? Why had they not followed the rivers or trails back to safety? And most pressing of all, what were they running from? The camera revealed no pursuers, no obvious threat, but some who watched swore they saw something else, an indistinct shape looming just beyond the edge of the frame, larger than either of the 2 figures. Officials dismissed it as a trick of light, a distortion caused by the swaying branches. But for many, the possibility that something or someone was trailing them could not be ignored. Armed with this new evidence, search teams were immediately redirected to the ravine where the camera had been placed. It was a remote, forbidding area, accessible only by narrow game trails and steep descents. For weeks, no one had thought to focus there. Now, suddenly, it became the center of everything. When the first team arrived, they found signs that had been overlooked before. Just a few hundred yards from the camera stood the remnants of a fire pit. Charred wood, ash scattered across damp ground. Nearby, beneath the twisted roots of a pine tree, lay a small mitten, brightly colored with a cartoon rabbit stitched on the side. Margaret, Evelyn's sister, later confirmed it belonged to Amelia. The discoveries were both hopeful and devastating. If Evelyn and Amelia had camped there, they had survived far longer than expected. But the site told a darker story. A cooking pot was still balanced on a stone, as if abandoned mid-use. Food wrappers were torn open and trampled into the dirt. Nothing was packed away. Nothing suggested they had left willingly. It looked less like a campsite that had been broken down, and more like one that had been fled. Investigators spread out, marking the ground with flags, searching for tracks. They found partial impressions in the mud, an adult's boots, a child's smaller shoes. But the prints overlapped and scattered in multiple directions, leading toward the river, into the dense forest, and onto rocky slopes where they vanished entirely. The confusion of tracks suggested panic. Something had startled them, driven them from the fire without a chance to gather their belongings. Rangers called out names into the ravine, their voices echoing back off stone walls. No reply came. The silence felt oppressive, heavy, almost unnatural. Some searchers described the sensation of being watched, though nothing moved in the shadows. The deeper they pushed into the ravine, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. What made the discovery most haunting was not just the evidence left behind, but the questions it raised. Why had Evelyn and Amelia not sought help, despite clearly being alive days after the disappearance? Why had they remained in such a remote and inaccessible part of the park? And what had caused them to abandon their camp so suddenly, leaving behind the mitten, the pot, the wrappers, as if they had been forced to run? In the weeks that followed, the footage circulated widely, both within official channels and among the public once the news broke. For many, it became an image impossible to shake. A mother and her daughter, lost and wandering, shadows of themselves, caught for less than a minute in the cold eye of an infrared lens. Some saw fear in Evelyn's expression. Others saw resignation, a quiet acceptance of fate. Still others claimed Amelia's figure seemed to falter, as if she had already given up hope. The clip provided confirmation that they had survived, but no clarity about what had happened next. It was proof, yes, but proof of what, exactly? That they had endured? That they had fled? That they were trapped in some cycle of fear only the wilderness itself understood? Whatever the truth, one reality became certain. Evelyn and Amelia's story was no longer just a disappearance. It had become a haunting mystery, its answers buried somewhere in the silence of that ravine, hidden just beyond the edge of the camera's gaze. The discovery of the wildlife camera footage should have brought clarity. Instead, it deepened the enigma. Evelyn and Amelia were alive nearly 2 weeks after their disappearance, walking, exhausted, frightened, but still together. Yet the campsite they left behind, abandoned in haste, and the mitten dropped in the dirt, suggested a story far more disturbing. As the footage circulated, law enforcement officials, local residents, and armchair sleuths across the country began offering theories. Each held weight, none fit perfectly. The simplest theory was disorientation. Perhaps Evelyn, in the chaos of the storm, had led Amelia deeper into the forest, away from established trails. In the vastness of Glacier National Park, even the most cautious hiker could lose their way. Once panic set in, they might have wandered aimlessly, circling ravines and rivers without realizing they were only miles from safety. Some investigators believed the abandoned camp was evidence of this. Evelyn may have tried to relocate in search of higher ground or clearer paths. But others argued this didn't explain the food left cooking, or the fact that their belongings remained untouched. Most people lost in the wilderness cling to their gear. Evelyn, by all accounts, a practical woman, would never have abandoned supplies voluntarily. Another explanation was wildlife. Glacier's forests are home to both black bears and mountain lions. A sudden encounter could have sent the mother and daughter fleeing in terror, leaving everything behind. Yet, this theory, too, had cracks. Rangers found no claw marks, no signs of a struggle, no blood or torn fabric. Predators leave evidence: shredded packs, trails of destruction. In this case, the site appeared eerily undisturbed, as if the pair had simply walked away. Some whispered of human involvement. The national park, vast and sparsely monitored, has long drawn not only hikers and campers, but also drifters, loners, and those looking to disappear. Could Evelyn and Amelia have crossed paths with someone dangerous, a stranger hidden in the woods, a hermit, or even another hiker with darker intentions? The scattered boot prints and the overlapping tracks lent weight to this theory. It seemed plausible that they had fled from someone, abandoning their meal mid-preparation. But again, there was no sign of violence. No, dropped belongings in the heat of a struggle. No indication of forced removal, only the silence of an interrupted life. Locals, more superstitious, offered stranger accounts. The ravine where the footage was captured had long carried a reputation among old-timers. They called it Hollow's End, a place avoided after dark. Stories circulated of voices on the wind, of travelers who wandered in and never came out. Most dismissed these tales as folklore, but when faced with the grainy footage of Evelyn glancing nervously toward the shadows, some began to wonder, had she too felt that unexplainable dread? Was there something unseen pressing in around them that night? Even within official circles, unease lingered. One ranger admitted privately that the footage unsettled him not because of what it showed, but because of what it didn't. They looked like they were waiting for something, he said. Or maybe being followed. His words echoed the interpretations of many who watched the tape frame by frame, convinced they saw a larger figure, indistinct but looming, at the very edge of the lens. Psychological explanations were also raised. Grief-stricken relatives wondered if exhaustion and stress had driven Evelyn into a kind of survival delirium. Perhaps she believed she was heading toward help, when in fact she was wandering deeper into danger. Amelia, too young to question, would have followed, without hesitation. But still, this failed to explain the suddenness of their flight from the campsite, or the impression of fear caught on the mother's face in those brief moments before the camera. Each theory circled the same truth. There were fragments of evidence, but no conclusion. Evelyn and Amelia had been alive? Yes. They had been surviving? Yes. But what they were enduring remained out of reach. The mitten, the fire pit, the footage, these were puzzle pieces that refused to lock together. In the end, the theories said more about those who proposed them than about what truly happened. Some needed a rational explanation. Lost hikers, a fatal mistake. Others leaned into the possibility of predators, human or animal. Still others embraced the mystery itself, convinced the forest was holding secrets beyond human understanding. And so the case remained suspended, balanced uneasily between logic and legend. Proof of life had been captured, but the forces that drove Evelyn and Amelia into the shadows of Hollow's End were left unspoken, unresolved. Months passed after the discovery of the wildlife camera footage, and still no trace of Evelyn and Amelia was ever found. The renewed search of the ravine yielded nothing beyond the abandoned campsite and the small mitten that once belonged to the little girl. Teams swept the surrounding forest for weeks, retracing every slope, riverbank, and hollow. Yet the wilderness remained stubbornly silent. It gave just enough to prove they had lived, only to conceal what came after. For the Carter family, the lack of closure was a torment worse than grief itself. Margaret, Evelyn's sister, left a lamp burning in her front window every night, telling neighbors it was meant to guide Evelyn and Amelia home if they ever found their way back. Local churches held vigils on anniversaries of their disappearance, but the gatherings grew smaller with each passing year. What lingered was not hope, but a hollow ache, a sense that two lives had been erased without reason. The farmhouse where Evelyn once lived stood in eerie stillness. Grass grew high in the yard. Windows remained shuttered. Toys that Amelia had once scattered across the porch were packed away by kind neighbors, but the emptiness of the place became its own memorial. It was as though time had frozen on the day they left for their trip, never to resume again. The wildlife camera clip took on a life of its own. Grainy, brief, and incomplete, it circulated endlessly online. Some viewers claimed to see sheer terror in Evelyn's expression. Others insisted Amelia appeared calm, almost resigned, as if she had accepted something her mother had not. Still others swore there was something in the background, an indistinct shadow, a presence following just beyond the lens. Each interpretation said more about the fears of those watching than about the truth itself. And perhaps that was what made the footage so haunting. It became a mirror, reflecting every person's darkest suspicion of what might have happened in those woods. Years turned into a decade. Rumors persisted. Hikers claimed to hear faint voices near Hollow's End, soft, indistinct, like a woman calling out for her child. Others reported the sensation of being watched, or glimpses of movement in the trees when no one else was there. Rangers dismissed these accounts as nerves, but for locals, they were proof that Evelyn and Amelia had never truly left. The tragedy of their disappearance was not only the loss of 2 lives, but the way it blurred the line between reality and legend. Were they victims of nature's indifference, of a predator, human or animal? Or had they stumbled into something stranger, a mystery older than the mountains themselves? No theory could fully answer the question. What endured was the image of a mother and daughter, captured for less than a minute in the sterile glow of an infrared lens, 2 figures drifting through the night, caught between survival and surrender. That single clip became their memorial, their epitaph. No graves, no closure, just the memory of shadows moving through the forest. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all. Sometimes the wilderness does not take lives in a way that can be explained. Sometimes it simply swallows them whole, leaving behind silence, fragments, and endless questions. Evelyn and Amelia Carter walked into Glacier National Park one summer morning, and in the eyes of the world, they never walked out again. What do you think really happened to Evelyn and Amelia in those mountains? Was it nature, human hands, or something far darker? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you want to hear more chilling disappearances and haunting mysteries, don't forget to subscribe to Last Seen and turn on notifications. That way, you'll never miss the next story that will keep you awake at night. Stay curious and stay safe.